Hello, and welcome to our St. Paul Learn with the League. We present these 1-hour programs for our community once a month. I'm Nona Binding, League board member and member of the program and membership committee. I'll be moderating tonight's presentation on the state of Minnesota water. Many thanks to the White Bear Area League and Roseville Area League for supporting tonight's talk. We'd also like to thank the St. Paul Neighborhood Network and SCCTV Suburban Community Channels for broadcasting and taping tonight's program. And you can check out our YouTube channel and view this program along with previous programs at any time. We're learning today on the ancestral homeland of the Dakota and the Anishinaabe people and the current home of several Native nations, including the Dakota and the Ojibwe. Land acknowledgement is only one small part of supporting Indigenous communities, and we hope that our land acknowledgement statement will inspire others to stand with us in solidarity with Native nations. Our program is being recorded and broadcast on Facebook Live in addition to Zoom. Feel free at any time to type in questions during the presentations into the Q&A on Zoom or in the comments on Facebook, and we will try to get to them. Remember that Zoom closed caption feature is auto-generated, so there are occasional inaccuracies. Why are we talking about water? Why are we talking about this? We're in Minnesota, the land of 10,000 lakes. We are surrounded by water. The St. Paul League, actually, of League of Women Voters, represents a city that is surrounded by one of the most impressive bodies of water in the world, the Mississippi River. We are served by the St. Paul Regional Water Service, SPRWS, who administers our water. In St. Paul, we are a bit unusual. We get water from both the Mississippi River and groundwater. We're one of the few cities in Minnesota that has a backup source, groundwater. Our first speaker tonight will chat about that, so I'm not going to get into it here, but SPRWS has a great website that shows a story of how we get our water, and that'll be listed on the YouTube channel after this event. Minneapolis, in contrast, relies solely on the Mississippi River and treats water almost immediately from the intake. I mention it because it illustrates that as municipalities, we're finding new ways to get creative with monitoring and mitigating water issues. After this presentation, we hope that you understand more about the big picture of how we get our water, some of the issues the future may hold, and what you might do to ensure that we're in the best possible water position for the people and our rivers and lakes. Our first speaker is Ellen Considine, and she's a hydrogeologist with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and an expert on Minnesota groundwater. She started her career sampling and gauging streams at the U.S. Geological Survey in Wisconsin, and then she worked as a groundwater modeler and field geologist and project manager for 10 years. She's joined the DNR in 2015, and she's focused now on areas in Minnesota where the groundwater sustainability and groundwater depletion of surface water is a concern. Our second speaker is Avonna Starck, who's received a bachelor's degree in political science and history from the U of Minnesota, master's degree in political management and advocacy from the George Washington University. She currently serves as a community member on the Fridley School Board and Fridley Charter Commission member. She became the Minnesota State Director of Clean Water Action, Minnesota, in November of 22, having worked in politics for almost 20 years. She's also a former legislative staffer and worked with dozens of candidates around Minnesota. She's had an extensive background in campaign management, fundraising, and community outreach. So these two very smart women about water are going to talk about what's going on here in the state and what we can do about it. And if you've got any questions, please type your questions again in the Q&A box on Zoom or on Facebook in the comments, and we'll have moderators standing by to pass on your questions. You may not hear it asked exactly as you posed it, but rest assured we will try to get to them all and combine them with others where appropriate. So please welcome Ellen Considine, and I'm going to stop my share so that she can pick it up. There you are.
Okay, thanks, Nona. I'm just going to have my video on here at the start. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to this audience today. Like Nona said, I'm a groundwater supervisor and hydrogeologist at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. And I'm going to talk about groundwater, drought, and climate change, and how we can ensure that we have stable groundwater supplies for years to come. Now with that, I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I'm going to stop my video just to avoid, bandwidth problems here. Okay, let's get started. So before I go any further, I need to acknowledge what Nona also acknowledged, that we live in the land of 10,000 lakes. Almost everywhere we go, we see water. So if you would, as you're sitting there in your house or on your porch or at work, think about, did you drive over a river bridge today? Maybe wave your screen or nod your head if you did. How many of you walked by a lake or a river in the past week? How many of you have been out on the water this summer? And I don't know for sure, but I would bet that most of you have done at least 2 and maybe all 3 of those things in the past week or so. But I want to flip that. I want to look at the other side of that. Have you ever run out of water at your house? If you live in the point is that in general, we're blessed with lots of water in Minnesota. I didn't really expect many of you to have ever been out of water, but our water is not unlimited. Our groundwater is an especially valuable resource, and I'm hoping to convince you to appreciate and protect that resource a little bit more today. But before I get too deep into talking about groundwater, I need to talk about a word that you're going to hear me use a lot, and that word is aquifer. A lot of you probably know what that means, but just in case, I thought I would define it. I'm going to use the words aquifer and groundwater sort of interchangeably today. So an aquifer is where nature stores water underground. Sometimes people imagine underground caves with rivers running through them, but that really doesn't happen very often. Most water occurs like in this picture. So if you imagine going to the beach and you're walking along the beach, there's water in between the grains of sand. So if we were to really zoom in on that sand right along the water's edge at the beach, and you could see each individual sand grain, you would see that indeed there's water between each individual sand grain. And that's what an aquifer is. So the aquifers that are under our feet in St. Paul are just this. They are grains of sand with water in between the grains of sand. And sometimes those grains of sand are unconsolidated or left behind by glaciers. So it's loose sand or gravel, like you would see at the beach. And sometimes it's hard cemented bedrock, like sandstone. But it's still, even when it's sandstone, there are grains of sand with water in between. Water can also occur in fractures that run through bedrock, like limestone or granite. So all of these things, I've zoomed in so you could see the water and you could see the rock material surrounding it, but these are all aquifers because you can get water out of them. So if you imagine that we could slice into the earth like a huge layer cake, in Minnesota, you would see something like this picture here. So before, we were looking down at the aquifer from the top, right? We were standing at the beach looking down at the water between the grains of sand. And now we've sliced down. And what you can see here is a couple different, you can see these different materials. There's sand and gravel at the top, and the blue shows where there's water in between the grains of sand and gravel. There might be what we call an aquitard. And this is a hydrogeologic word that describes a clay or silt layer, and water doesn't move very easily through those. There might be more sand and gravel, except this time it's buried under an aquitard. And then as you go down deeper, you'll find bedrock aquifers where water might be moving through fractures, like you saw on the last slide, those water moving through horizontal or vertical fractures in the rock. So we have these layers of sand. In summary, we have these layers of sand and gravel and rock, and these are all carrying water. And these are all the different kinds of aquifers that we have in Minnesota. But it depends on where you are in Minnesota. Some parts of Minnesota have mostly bedrock aquifers. Some parts of Minnesota have mostly buried sand and gravel aquifers. So this map that you see on the left takes all the information you saw on the slice that I just showed you, that slice into the earth, and it translates that information into a map. And so you see this map and you see these different colors, and they're each numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So these are what we call Minnesota's groundwater provinces. And these provinces are pretty much numbered in order of groundwater availability. So you probably already noticed that the metro area, Ramsey County and St. Paul, are sitting in groundwater province 1, which is great. That means that groundwater here is fairly abundant. You have sand and gravel that has water in it. You can use those as aquifers. You also have bedrock aquifers where water is moving through fractures in the bedrock. Your groundwater is just generally fairly abundant. It's not unlimited, but it's pretty abundant. On the other hand, if you imagine going up to cabin country along the North Shore in this pink or mauve, groundwater province 6, groundwater is really, really limited in groundwater province 6. And that's why the communities along the North Shore often rely on, I think almost always rely on Lake Superior for their drinking water. So we've talked about the extremes. We've talked about the metro area and groundwater province 1, where there's generally pretty abundant groundwater, not unlimited, but pretty abundant. You'll hear me say that again and again. And we've talked about province 6, where there's very little groundwater. Now this story today starts, oh, sorry, I forgot about my animations. Look at that. This story today starts actually out in groundwater province 5. So if you imagine if we were to get in the car and drive about 300 miles northwest to the tiny city of Warren, Minnesota. This is along the border of Polk and Marshall counties. And as you'll notice, it's in groundwater province 5. And I think I mentioned this, so reminder, that just means it has a little more groundwater than province 6, but still not much. So keep that in mind. That'll help you predict the rest of my story here. The story about Warren starts in July of 2021. At that time, Northwest Minnesota was in extreme drought. So for those of you who are old enough like me to remember the drought of 1988, it was that severe of a drought. This is a drought that the kind of drought that occurs in less than 2 out of 100 years. When we get a drought like that, crops without irrigation systems are lost and the fire risk is really high. Around Warren, the city of Warren, there were 4 farmers who had groundwater wells and irrigation systems. And I should mention, they all had permits from the DNR to use that groundwater. And they were pumping that groundwater to keep their crops alive. And drought is the reason that they had irrigation systems and wells and permits, right? It's a form of insurance for the dry years. And we all need farmers to be able to grow crops. But when high capacity wells, like these irrigation wells, use a lot more water than usual, like in a drought, if you have a garden, you know your garden wants a lot more water in a drought, that's going to lower the water level in the aquifer. So this image gives you an idea of what is going on underground when a high capacity well pumps. And if you haven't seen an image like this before, it's going to look like a lot, but I'll walk you through it. So first, just like in the slice that I showed you earlier, here we've sliced into the earth so we can look at what's happening with the water levels and what's going on with the wells. And you can see this dashed line at the top shows where the water level is in the aquifer before this big well turns on. When the big well turns on, it lowers the water level in the aquifer. And you can see this kind of cone shape here. We call this a cone of depression, or maybe it looks a little bit triangular. When you're closer to the pumping well, the water level is drawn down more. And when you're further away, there's less and less drawdown from the high capacity well. Now, what happens when the water level is lowered from high capacity pumping is that nearby wells, especially if they're shallower wells, can run out of water. And in July of 2021, we got a call from the city of Warren. And so for today, we're going to say this well The middle well is the City of Warren well. And they call this because water levels were really low in their well. So they weren't quite out of water. And this is the pump hanging in their well. But you can see that the water level is just on top of the pump. So they were still able to pump water, but they knew that if the water level got much lower and got below the pump, they wouldn't be able to pump water anymore. And the City of Warren only had this one well. They didn't have a backup well. It's a very small town, as you might have noticed on the previous slide. The population is, I think, around 1,000. So again, that water level was really, really close to the pump in the well. So they didn't have a backup well. And normally a city would lower the pump. But if you remember in 2021, I'm sure you do, there were lots of supply chain problems. So that meant the city couldn't lower their pump right away. And as I mentioned, Warren didn't have their own backup. Well, they did have a backup water supply, but their backup water supplier was the local rural water supply well. So Nona talked about St. Paul Regional Water Supply. A rural water supplier is the same thing, except it's rural. So they have well fields in places where you can find an aquifer, which isn't always, they aren't always there. There isn't always an aquifer in Western Minnesota. And then they deliver water to their customers, and their customers buy water from them. So the City of Warren's backup water supply was the well for the rural water supply. But as you'll notice, water levels were also getting low in the rural water supply well. Now, as we looked into the situation at the DNR, we realized that pumping groundwater for irrigation from big wells like this had lowered the water level in the aquifer by 70 feet since the start of the irrigation season. And for reference, 70 feet in the Minnesota groundwater world is a lot. We commonly see 5 or 10 feet of drawdown during the irrigation season, sometimes 25 or 30, but 70 feet of drawdown in just a few months of pumping was very concerning. Groundwater levels in this area were lower than they'd ever been. And we realized that between the City of Warren supplying, say, around 1,000 customers and the rural water suppliers' customers, the water supply for over 6,000 people was endangered. And there was no backup for these systems. So we made the tough decision and we ordered the irrigators to stop pumping. Thankfully, water levels in the aquifer rose pretty quickly after the irrigators stopped pumping, and a crisis was averted. The City of Warren lowered their well pump a few weeks later, and this will give them a little bit more protection in the next drought. But that isn't really the end of the story. So you'll remember this map from earlier, and maybe you'll remember that Warren is in Groundwater Province 5, and that's again shown in green. I think I didn't mention that before. I should have mentioned that in green. Groundwater Province 5 is green. It's western and northwest Minnesota. And the aquifers in this part of the state are usually very small, and they recharge or refill really, really slowly. Now, Groundwater Province 5, the green area, is also where we're seeing a huge increase in demand for groundwater. And I suspect it might be in part, that increase in demand might be in part because of climate change. You probably know that climate change means Minnesota's climate will generally be warmer and it will be wetter, right, in the future. But climate change also means more weather extremes like drought. So we can expect more extreme droughts in between the wet periods to come. So this might seem counterintuitive, but think of what has happened in California over the past few years. They went from record-setting wildfires like Paradise in 2018 to devastating floods like the Russian River earlier this year. Same geography, relatively close together. These extreme weather events very close to each other, which historically it would sometimes happen, but what we're going to see with climate change is more extreme weather events. So in northern Minnesota, we're already seeing the effects of a warming climate. Northern Minnesota is warming faster than the rest of the state. So that means winters there are shorter and the growing season is longer. Crops can be grown in northern Minnesota that couldn't be grown before, and that leads to more groundwater used for irrigation. And I should mention, in fairness, that Minnesota isn't unique here. Scientific American studied this, and they found that overall the US Corn Belt is shifting north because of climate change. Now, just like the warming part of climate change causes more groundwater use, so too will the drought part of climate change. And that part is pretty obvious, because when there's a drought, we need to use more groundwater, well, just more water, and in particular in Western Minnesota, more groundwater to keep crops and plants alive. But in Western Minnesota, where there is very limited groundwater, I mentioned small aquifers that refill really slowly, there will need to be difficult conversations about the value of water and what we want to use it for, because it might not be available to meet all of our wishes. Now I want to talk about this, what this means for you in St. Paul. So we're going to travel back. Oh, excuse me, that didn't do what I wanted it to. So we're going to travel back down to St. Paul, 300 miles back down to the yellow, the groundwater province 1. And you'll remember from earlier that St. Paul is sitting on pretty abundant groundwater. But St. Paul, interestingly, and Nona mentioned this, St. Paul and its surrounding suburbs get most of their water from the Mississippi River. Your water is supplied by St. Paul Regional Water Services, which is a public utility. So they take water out of the river at Fridley, and the water is routed through underground conduits, then through reservoir lakes in the North Metro. St. Paul has groundwater wells, which are used for the backup supply, and I think to supplement surface water as needed. So first of all, thumbs up to St. Paul Regional Water Services. Getting water mostly from the river and reserving groundwater for backup or kind of to supplement means your water supply is much more robust than the one you heard about in Warren. You have a backup, first of all, that's great. And you have a backup that is a very different source than your primary source. So that means you have options in case of emergency. Also, by using surface water as much as it is available and saving groundwater for when you really need it, I like to think of it as building your groundwater savings account. So you can see the piggy bank in this picture is saving for a rainy day, but you're saving your groundwater for a day that is not rainy. Now, since you heard about Warren's groundwater levels getting so low, you might be wondering about St. Paul's groundwater levels. Your groundwater levels are generally pretty stable. So that means we're not seeing big declines like we saw in Warren during 2021. We're keeping an eye on groundwater levels in the outer suburbs. Those suburbs rely more on groundwater, and the Met Council's projections indicate that we could have much lowered groundwater levels in future. So we need to look out for that. But in St. Paul, your water levels are generally trending pretty stable. Now a bit about your groundwater quality. Like nearly all developed places, St. Paul has some groundwater contamination. So probably the most visible site is the former Ford plant, which is a Superfund site. First, I should say I'm not an expert in the Ford site, and there's lots of information on the City of St. Paul's website. But the Ford plant is still a good example of what a pervasive problem groundwater contamination can be. Ford dumped waste chemicals along the Mississippi River from the 1940s until the 1960s. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency was first alerted to the hazardous contamination there in 1980, but by then other construction debris had been dumped onto the hazardous materials, making cleanup difficult to impossible. And even if it were possible to actually get to the original hazardous waste containers, what was inside those containers has often long ago leaked into the groundwater. And once chemicals are in groundwater, it's very hard or impossible to get them out. I think of this like, for those of you who have toddlers, sometimes you might dilute their juice with water, and you really can't let them see you do that if they don't like water in their juice, because once you've put the water in, you can't get it back out. And the same is true of contaminants in groundwater. It is very, very hard to get them back out. As you probably know, communities just next door in Washington County are having to design their groundwater pumping systems very carefully to make sure they don't draw in contamination left behind by 3M. So even though in Washington County they have abundant aquifers, just like you do in St. Paul, historic poor handling of waste means large parts of those aquifers just can't be used. And now, what you can do about it. So first of all, you can just be a steward of water resources. Think about the water cycle. Your everyday actions do make a difference to protect groundwater for future generations. Everything you put on the landscape can end up in groundwater, and once it is there, it might be there for a long time. Everything you put up in the trash will end up in a landfill. So when you have hazardous waste like chemicals or batteries, don't mix them in with your regular trash. Take them to a proper disposal site. If you can compost or bring your food waste to a composting site, do it. The more you can keep out of landfills, the better for groundwater. We try to build landfills so that they don't leak, but they will. Things that are underground leak. I would also encourage you to learn where your water comes from. I'm not going to play this video today. There is a link to it at the end of my presentation. St. Paul Regional Water Service has wonderful information on their website that tells you about where your water comes from. So educate yourselves, educate your neighbors, really just become aware of that water cycle. And as you're learning, I encourage you to also learn about where your wastewater goes. Whatever you wash down the drain or flush has to go somewhere. It has to be treated at water treatment plants, and those water treatment plants eventually discharge treated water back into the environment. Things like chemicals and medication add more load to water treatment plants, and they can be difficult to remove. If you can, choose soaps that don't contain phosphates. I also encourage you to start practicing for drought. So think about where you could use a little bit less city water. If you using rain barrels, for example, can reduce how much water is coming to your house and can also reduce how much water the storm sewers have to handle. You can check your toilet for leaks, which is surprisingly simple to do, and there's information about how to do it on St. Paul's website. You can take shorter showers. And my personal favorite is to just reuse water when you can. So like when I wash my fruits and vegetables, I save that water and I use it to water my plants. So just think about where you can just trim a little bit here and a little bit there. And finally for today, just remembering that water and groundwater are precious. So I encourage you to think of groundwater as your piggy bank. Eventually, St. Paul and all of Minnesota will experience extreme drought. It has always been a part of our climate, but in future droughts are likely to be more extreme. We will have droughts at some point that will last for years, like the 1930s. And when that time comes, you will need groundwater. And trying to conserve groundwater after the drought has come is like trying to build your emergency savings when you've already been laid off. Conserve water now so it will be there when you need it. And I think on a parting note, I wanted to mention that right now, the aquifers in the core of the metro are doing pretty well. Water levels are fairly stable, but that wasn't always the case. There was a period of time when we pumped that water in a pretty reckless way. We used it for cooling at power plants, and groundwater levels got really low. Our groundwater systems have already shown us that they are not limitless. We know this from the past. We learned from that. We changed how we use groundwater, but we want to stay on that trajectory. And again, save that groundwater in your piggy bank so you have it when the drought comes. Thank you for having me. And with that, I believe Nona mentioned this list of resources may be available on the website or with the presentation. With that, I'm going to stop presenting and hand it over to Avonna.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm going to share my screen as soon as my computer cooperates. All right. So the state of Minnesota water, we've had a lot going on at Clean Water Action and with the work that we've been doing with regards to how we communicate with members and community as well as legislation. We are an organization dedicated to swimmable, fishable, and drinkable water for all, and we have 19 offices in 13 different states. We've been in Minnesota since 1982. One of our programs is called Healthy Legacy, and that program is working to reshape chemical policy in Minnesota and the United States to protect public health and the environment from the adverse impacts of toxic chemicals. This is the program that really leads our work with regards to lead and toxic chemicals such as PFAS. So we have a program team made up of a variety of programs, including Healthy Legacy. We also have a great new program called Rethink Disposable, and that program is really focused on reducing the use of single-use plastics, particularly within food service. We have a field and phone canvas team that allows us to meet individuals on their turf. We don't expect people to come to us to learn. We want to bring the information directly to the community. And then, of course, we are made up of members that support the work that we do. We advocate in a variety of ways. Here's a picture of us down in St. Peter meeting with Representative Jeff Brand, who is the chief author of some legislation that we worked on around PFAS. And so we went down into the community and talked about that work. So we have Canvas teams who directly educate individuals at their door and via phone. We also hold town halls and forums, listening sessions where we hear directly from community about what is at the forefront of their concerns. We engage individuals and decision makers via social media. We are known to write the occasional letter to the editor. We work really closely with decision makers, particularly during the legislative session, and we coalition build. So we work with other organizations in the environmental realm to double, triple, quadruple our impact, whether it's impact with the community or impact at the legislature. And then we also engage in just a variety of community events. One of the programs that Healthy Legacy is active in is a presentation much like this, but it is meant for ECFE, early childhood classrooms, where we go in and we talk to parents and caregivers about how to keep their homes and their kiddos safe. So lead is a particularly nasty toxin that comes through primarily through water. It's got a cumulative effect. It builds up in your body. It is distributed to the brain, liver, kidneys, and the bones. It's actually stored in teeth and bones, and it accumulates over time and it builds up. And the best way to assess levels of lead in the body is through blood. And then you can see over here a map of the human body and the various impacts lead has. And we know that it is particularly toxic to small children because of the fact that their brain is still developing. As lead in your bones is released into your blood during pregnancy, it becomes a source of exposure for the developing fetus. So it's particularly, again, dangerous for developing fetuses and children. And there's no known level of exposure that's safe. Like, it is toxic no matter how you cut it, but it is preventable. So you can test your water, you can use a filter, and then there's a variety of things that you can do if you know you have lead pipes or a service line. So it's important to know that there are other things you can do to protect your family from lead exposure, but how do you know if you are at risk for exposure? Most of the risk is tied to your home's age. Most lead service lines were installed in homes that were built before 1926. Which is a real heartbreaker for me. I'm a lover of old architecture, and I keep trying to convince my husband to sell our house so we can buy an older home and fix it up. A small percentage of homes built between 1942 and 1947 also have lead service lines, and these homes are at higher risk of lead leaching from the pipes. The installation of new lead service lines was prohibited in 1986, and that ban became effective in 1988. Estimates indicate there may be 6.5 to 10 million lead service lines still delivering water across the country. If we're looking at Minnesota specific, the Minnesota Department of Health estimates there are about 100,000 water service lines in the state, leaching lead into drinking water through the flow of water. And some estimates that I've seen are as high as 260,000 lead service lines. So I'm going to pop back here for just a split second. If you know you have service lines, make sure you're only using cold water for cooking and making baby formula. We have a 1.5-year-old, and this is just, I think about all the bottles that I've made him. You want to make sure that you're not using warm water for the sink. It can be really tempting to do that late at night when baby is upset and wants their bottle, but make sure you're using cold water and you heat it in another way. If pipes are being unused for over 6 hours, make sure you run the water for a period of time to get anything that might have settled out of there. And then once a month, make sure that you are removing or rinsing your aerator. That's that little part on your sink that unscrews, and it's got that little screen looking thing that can pop out of it. So make sure you're checking that as well. So we did a lot of work this session, particularly around lead service lines and lead pipes in school. One bill that we championed was authored by Senator McEwen and Representative Jordan, and that does a lot to tackle the issue of lead service lines and the cost to replace them. The bill gives the MDH direction to distribute $30 million a year until 2032 via grants to municipalities to upgrade lead service lines. The two most significant contributors of lead in drinking water are municipality-owned lead service lines and leaded lines connecting those pipes to private households. The grant will replace both contamination sources. Municipalities will develop plans to contact private residents about getting their drinking water tested and replace their lead pipes if needed at no cost. 70% of the grant funds will be used for removing privately owned portions of lead drinking water service lines, installing privately owned portions of drinking water service lines, or repaying debt incurred to remove or replace privately owned portions of lead drinking water service lines. According to MDH, homes built before 1940 will likely have lead service lines that connect them to public water, and plumbing systems built before 1986 may have lead components. There was also funding dedicated to addressing lead service lines in schools and childcare facilities. The Lead Safe Housing Fund that you see at the bottom here, that is a one-time appropriation for a grant program. The commissioner of the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency is directed to establish a grant program to reduce hazards in homes via lead testing. They will prioritize low-income communities and areas where there's a high concentration of lead poisoning in children. The grant money must be split between metro counties and outstate counties, so there's not that concern of one portion of the state monopolizing the majority of the funding. So there's a lot that you can do. You can contact decision makers, and decision makers don't just sit at the state legislature. This is county commission, this is your city council, everything in between, and also having conversations. I'm on the school board, having conversations with your school board members and your superintendent to understand whether or not your kids are safe drinking the water at school, what safety protocols are in place in schools, that sort of thing. Having conversations with your neighbors, your friends, and your family. If you live in a community where the housing stock tends to be a little bit older, are your neighbors aware that there is a possibility that they could have lead service lines? Are they aware and prepared to engage with the state to ensure that they're where they need to be on the list of prioritizing the replacement of their lead service lines? And I really liked the hints that Ellen gave around starting small and changing one habit at a time. When you're cleaning, if lead is also found in paint in homes that are a bit older. So if you're dusting, make sure that your rag is watered down so that you're not putting potentially lead-filled dust into the air as you clean. Do your research on appropriate lead filters for the type of sink that you have. Make sure that you're communicating with your community and engaging in that capacity. Sasha is our environmental justice organizer, and he does a lot of work environmental justice communities. If you have any questions around what that might look like, his contact information is right there. Chloe is our Rethink organizer, and that is that program that I spoke about in the beginning that seeks to reduce single-use plastic use in restaurants. They're also working with schools and other institutions such as hospitals are a really good example around decreasing the use of these single-use plastics that inevitably end up in our landfills. One landfill stat that I find amazing and not in a good way is that 98 of our 101 closed landfills in Minnesota are leaching toxics into the groundwater, and that includes all sorts of chemicals that are really difficult to remove and clean up. And that just means a price tag, right? Because somebody has to do that, and that typically falls on the voters. And then, of course, if you have any additional questions, there is my contact information. We also do a lot of work on social media, and we try to share as many helpful hints as possible regarding actions that you can take every day to keep your water safe and clean and healthy. Thank you.
Well, that was wonderful. Thank you both so much for those two really impactful presentations. Now, we have had some great questions coming in from the audience. And I think I'll start first with Ellen. You were talking about landfills and trash and waste disposal. And keeping things out of the landfill. There is some question as to what percentage of our, and you're not experts in our waste. I understand that, but here in St. Paul, we generally are under the assumption that a lot of our waste is incinerated. Someplace in Minnesota, we're not sure, it's been in the news here and there. They're talking about, this the incinerator problem that we have. So how does that kind of relate to groundwater? Other than I know that, it takes a lot of energy and, everything becomes ash or smoke in the air, and then that rain brings it back down. But can you speak to the idea of incineration versus landfill and how it relates to groundwater?
Yeah, so I apologize. I did know at one point my brain knew that my brain knew that St. Paul incinerated, but I'd forgotten that. Yeah. So great question. And I think, like you said, Nona, I'm not an expert on this, but my response would be the same as yours, that, there is always that risk if you're incinerating something toxic, that it will become airborne and then be reintroduced through rain somewhere downwind.
Well, and thank you. And to draw the lead pipe issue close to the idea of our groundwater, there was a question from the audience about what role does the way if you had lead discharge pipes in your home, what's the propensity for that to leach into the groundwater? Is that something that's of concern too?
Lead pipes are the delivery vehicle, and when those pipes have the sediment that comes through the tap, and that's when it's consumed. Boiling water won't get rid of lead. As far as the outside deterioration of lead pipes, yeah, I think that's absolutely a possibility that these, you see these pictures of the pipes with the gaping holes in them because they have, I'll start my video there, because they've started to deteriorate, and that seeps in as well.
Got it. Got it. One of our questions too just came in about how big a role do medications put down the toilet or as they come through our body and into the toilet? How big of an impact is that really on our groundwater? Ellen, I
You know,
guess that's for you.
that is a new area of study. There have been some really fascinating studies done on this, like down in Madison, Wisconsin. I think everybody expected that there would be medications found. For example, if you have a treatment plant and it treats the water and then it discharges into a surface water, we expected to find medications there. But in Madison, they found medications in deep aquifers, hundreds of feet underground.
Oh, my.
And that was really surprising. So this is an area, I would call it an area of emerging concern. We are hydrogeologists are trying to get their arms around the problem.
Understood. Understood. What about it's always out there. You hear about it from time to time that the American Southwest wants to take the water from the Great Lakes. I know, again, you're the groundwater specialist, and Avonna, you're really our lobby specialist. You understand kind of the ins and outs of this kind of political landscape. What's reality there? Should we be worried about that?
So I'm going to speak as a scientist who knows a little bit about the Great Lakes and groundwater. When you stand on the shore of Lake Superior or Lake Michigan, which is actually behind me back there in my background scene, they seem so enormous, right? They seem bottomless. But in actuality, if we were to start pumping huge amounts of groundwater out of them and shipping that water away, those lakes would shrink pretty quickly. They are not lakes that just replenish so quickly you can just pump out of them and water will just keep coming back in. And I think the Great Lakes states, so from a scientific perspective, it's not the bottomless source that it appears to be. And I think Great Lakes states are very, very protective of their lakes. And we do have the Great Lakes Compact. And I believe part of the reason we have the Great Lakes Compact is to prevent that sort of thing from occurring.
Yeah, Canada would have something to say about it, I'm sure. Avonna, maybe something for you that you might be able to speak to, and Ellen, chime in here where appropriate. But the idea of working with our native nations, I know that lead pipes are something that's particular to older kind of developments and older homes. Living in a 100-year-old house right now, I can tell you, I know I have a lead service pipe, and it's just a matter of how we're going to deal with that. But how do we work with our native nations or communities to try to work on their groundwater supply, make sure that they have flowing water for clean water and sanitation, in addition to lead service pipes? Is there something very particular to that environment that you could share with our listeners?
Yeah, we've been working really hard to build relationships and communicate. We are a member of the Environmental Justice Table, and that is a coalition of organizations who are really focused on issues around environmental justice. An example we were talking about incineration is the HERC in Minneapolis and all of the air pollution and health effects felt by the community within the HERC's vicinity. And I was really pleased. It was really wonderful to watch this legislative session, Indigenous lawmakers advocating for the communities and making sure that those voices were represented. So I think we're heading in a really, really wonderful direction in terms of making sure that everyone is taken care of and all voices are heard.
Wonderful. Well, we usually ask our speakers to give our listeners one call to action. If they were going to try to do just one thing, what would that be? Here's your opportunity, Ellen and Avonna, to really drive it home that this is, something that we should not only just know about, but take action where appropriate. And we'd love to hear what you think that action could be.
Sure. I would say ask questions and vote. This shouldn't be a partisan issue. Everyone relies on drinking water. Everyone relies on clean air. And I had some very promising conversations this session where everyone, both sides of the aisle, they agreed that environmental issues like this should not be partisan. They don't want it to be partisan. So I think asking questions of candidates and holding them accountable and reminding them of the promises that they've made and letting them know that this is an important issue to you is the first best step to take.
Wonderful, thank you. And Ellen, how do you feel about that question? What can we do?
I would, on an individual level, always be thinking about that drought. So just as you save in case you're ever laid off, conserve water so it's there in a drought. And then as you're going through your life and talking to your neighbors and paying attention to what's happening in your neighborhood, pay attention. If somebody seems to be dumping something that doesn't go there, raise your hand, say something.
Just like at the airport, if you see something, say something, right?
Exactly. I like that. Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you both so much. I'm going to share my screen for a couple wrap-up items here. And bandwidth is a little spotty, but here we go. Okay. So we have some important upcoming voting dates for 2023. You can see them here. Also, we tend to sponsor candidate forums and other information coming from our local league. We are here to help you. The league is a nonpartisan organization over 100 years old. We're devoted to educating the public and on candidates and issues, as well as promoting reliable and secure elections for our country. We study issues, we take positions, and we take action. Back. We don't do technology awesome all the time, but here we go. You can help us do just that. You can find us on the internet. We have links to the St. Paul site, the state league, and also the national league, so that you can learn more about becoming a League of Women Voters member. It's not just for women, and we'd love to have you join us. Again, gratitude to the Roseville and White Bear Lake leagues for their support tonight. And again, SEC and SPNN, please stay on for just a couple seconds afterwards and answer a brief survey that'll pop up at the end of the program. We read all your responses. We're always looking for ways to improve and to stay relevant for viewers' interests. Have a great evening.